Marcus Johnson had lived a life defined by quiet dignity and perseverance. Growing up in the South Side of Chicago, he had navigated the treacherous waters of poverty and systemic inequality with a resilience that was both admirable and heartbreaking. His dark brown eyes, now lined with crow's feet at the corners, had witnessed both tremendous joy and unspeakable sorrow throughout his 45 years of life. As a maintenance supervisor at Memorial Hospital for the past 2 decades, Marcus had built a reputation as the man who could fix anything. His hands, callous and strong, moved with practiced precision, whether he was repairing an HVAC system or carefully tending to the community garden he'd helped establish in his neighborhood. He wore his uniform with pride, navy blue work pants and a matching shirt with Marcus, embroidered above the pocket, a symbol of the stability he had worked so hard to achieve. What few people knew about Marcus was the depth of his personal story. His wife, Shanice, had passed away from breast cancer 3 years earlier, leaving him to raise their teenage daughter, Zoe, alone. Since then, he had become both mother and father to her, attending every parent-teacher conference, helping with homework, and attempting to fill the void left by her mother's absence. Their small apartment was filled with photos of Shanice, her radiant smile frozen in time, a constant reminder of both what they had lost and what they were fighting to preserve. A family. Despite his circumstances, Marcus had always believed in the system. He paid his taxes on time, voted in every election, and taught his daughter that education and hard work were the paths to a better future. He had never had any run-ins with the law until now. On the other side of the bench sat Judge Richard Harrington, a figure who commanded the courtroom with an iron fist and a razor-sharp tongue. At 62, Judge Harrington was a towering presence 6'3" with broad shoulders and a full head of silver hair that added to his authoritative appearance. His black robe, perfectly pressed and worn like armor, symbolized the power he wielded with unflinching confidence. With 30 years on the bench, Harrington had earned a reputation as the Hammer. Defense attorneys trembled when they learned their cases were assigned to his courtroom. Prosecutors, on the other hand, often smiled at their good fortune. His sentencing was notoriously harsh, and his patience for emotional displays was non-existent. "This courtroom runs on facts, not feelings," was his famous refrain, delivered with the cold precision of a surgeon's scalpel. Born into a wealthy family with a long legal legacy, Harrington had attended the finest schools and moved in elite social circles. His grandfather had been a judge, his father a renowned defense attorney, and his path had seemed predetermined from birth. His office walls were adorned with degrees from Princeton and Harvard Law, alongside hunting trophies and photographs of himself with various political figures, evidence of a life of privilege and power. What few people saw was the emptiness that lurked behind the judge's steely blue eyes. Divorced twice, estranged from his only son for 15 years, Harrington lived alone in a mansion that echoed with silence. His life had become his work, and his work had become an exercise in control in a world that increasingly made less sense to him. Year after year, the same crimes, the same excuses, the same pleas for mercy had hardened something within him, calcified his compassion into rigid judgment. The courthouse itself stood as a third character in this unfolding drama, a grand neoclassical building in the heart of downtown, its marble steps worn from the footsteps of thousands seeking justice, or at least resolution. The American flag flapped gently in the breeze outside as sunlight streamed through the tall windows, casting long rectangles of light across the polished floor of Courtroom 4B. It was 10:37 a.m. when Marcus Johnson's case was called. The charge: trespassing and destruction of property, a misdemeanor, but one that carried potential jail time given the circumstances. Marcus stood with his public defender, an overworked young woman named Sarah Chun, who had spent precisely 15 minutes reviewing his case before court began. "All rise." The Honorable Judge Richard Harrington presiding, announced a bailiff, his voice reverberating through the courtroom. Judge Harrington entered with measured steps, his expression already set in a mask of impatience. He glanced at the docket, then at Marcus, taking his warm but clean work clothes and nervous posture with a quick, dismissive assessment. Case number 2025, CR 8723, the People versus Marcus Johnson, called the court clerk. "How does the defendant plead?" Judge Harrington asked, barely looking up from the file before him. "Not guilty, Your Honor," Sarah responded, Her voice steady despite the butterflies in her stomach. This was only her second month on the job. The prosecutor, a seasoned veteran named James Wilson, approached the bench. Your Honor, the defendant was caught breaking into Franklin Elementary School at 11:30 p.m. on April 15th. When security arrived, he had already damaged a lock on the gymnasium door and was inside the premises without authorization. Judge Harrington's eyebrows raised slightly as he looked directly at Marcus. Care to explain why you were breaking into an elementary school in the middle of the night, Mr. Johnson? Marcus stepped forward, his voice trembling slightly. Your Honor, I wasn't breaking in to steal or damage anything. My daughter, did you or did you not break the lock on the gymnasium door? The judge interrupted. Yes, sir, but... And were you or were you not on school property after hours without permission? I was... But if I could just explain. Judge Harrington held up his hand. The facts seem quite clear. This is a simple case of trespassing and destruction of public property. Though why doesn't change the what, Mr. Johnson. Sarah Chin stepped forward. Your Honor, if you allow my client to explain the circumstances, I believe you'll find there were significant mitigating factors. The judge sighed audibly, checking his watch. Very well. Make it quick, Mr. Johnson. Marcus took a deep breath, his hands gripping the edge of the table before him. My daughter Zoe is graduating next week. She's a valedictorian. A note of pride crept into his voice despite his nervousness. She's been practicing her speech in our apartment, but our neighbor's been sick, and we've been trying to keep quiet. The school principal, Mrs. Taylor, she knows me. I've done maintenance work there before. She said Zoe could practice in the gym after hours, and she'd leave a key under Matt. He paused, swallowing hard. That night, I went to pick up Zoe after her practice, but the key wasn't there. I called Mrs. Taylor, but couldn't reach her. Zoe was inside alone. Her phone was dead, and I could see her through the window, looking scared. So I broke the lock. I left a note and called the school the next morning to explain and offer to pay for repairs, but they'd already called the police. As Marcus finished speaking, his eyes glistened with tears. The thought of his daughter alone, frightened, waiting for him had broken something loose inside him. A single tear tracked down his cheek. Judge Harrington watched this display with growing irritation. Then, something unexpected happened. He laughed. Not a full laugh, but a dismissive chuckle that echoed in the now silent courtroom. Mr. Johnson, he said, his voice dripping with condescension. That's quite a creative story. But this court sees parents using their children as excuses for criminal behavior every single day. The fact remains that you broke into a school. It's not an excuse, Marcus interrupted, his voice suddenly firm despite the tears. I'm trying to be a good father. My wife died 3 years ago, and I promised her I'd always be there for our daughter. Always. The judge's face hardened. You're out of order, Mr. Johnson. One more outburst, and I'll hold you in contempt. Sarah Chin quickly intervened. Your Honor, we have character witnesses present who can attest to Mr. Johnson's reputation, including his employer of 20 years. We also have a statement from Principal Taylor confirming parts of Mr. Johnson's account. Which parts? The judge asked sharply. That she did occasionally allow Zoe to use the gym, though she denied specifically arranging for access at night, Sarah admitted. Judge Harrington leaned back in his chair, a satisfied expression crossing his face. So the core of Mr. Johnson's defense that he had implicit permission to break into the school is unsubstantiated. He looked directly at Marcus, who was wiping away tears with the back of his hand. Your Honor, please, Marcus said, his voice breaking. I've never been in trouble before. I was just trying to protect my daughter. The judge's mouth twisted into a smirk, and he let out another short, derisive laugh. Mr. Johnson, save the performance. This courtroom operates on facts, not feelings. A murmur rippled through the spectators. Sarachin looked horrified. The prosecutor shifted uncomfortably in his seat, but Judge Harrington seemed oblivious to the reaction his callousness had provoked. It was at that precise moment that the heavy doors at the back of the courtroom swung open, sound effect of doors opening dramatically. All heads turned toward the noise. Standing in the doorway was a young black woman in her early 20s, dressed in a crisp navy blazer and pencil skirt. Her natural hair was styled in a neat, professional updo, and she carried a leather portfolio clutched tightly against her chest. Her eyes, wide and expressive, immediately found Marcus, and for a moment her professional demeanor cracked to reveal a flash of deep concern. "This court is in session," Judge Harrington barked. "Take a seat or leave." The young woman straightened her shoulders and walked confidently down the center aisle, her heels clicking purposefully against the marble floor. Instead of finding a seat among the spectators, she approached the defense table. "Your Honor," she said, her voice clear and steady, "my name is Zoe Johnson. I'm the defendant's daughter and a material witness to the events in question." Judge Harrington's expression flickered with annoyance. "Miss Chun, is this your witness?" Because proper procedure would have been to have her wait outside until called. Before Sarah could respond, Zoe spoke again. "I'm not just a witness, Your Honor. I'm also here as co-counsel for my father." A ripple of surprise moved through the courtroom. Judge Harrington's eyebrows shot up, and he leaned forward. "Co-counsel? On whose authority?" "On the authority of the State Bar, Your Honor. I'm a licensed attorney." Zoe produced her bar card and handed it to the bailiff, who brought it to the judge. Judge Harrington examined the card with clear skepticism. "Ms. Johnson, you appear to be barely out of law school." "I graduated from Northwestern Law last year, Your Honor, and I've been clerking for Justice Maria Ramirez at the State Supreme Court since then." The mention of Justice Ramirez, a highly respected jurist known for her brilliant legal mind and uncompromising ethics, caused a subtle shift in Judge Harrington's demeanor. His eyes narrowed as he studied Zoe more carefully. "And you wish to represent your father? That seems like a conflict of interest, Ms. Johnson. With all due respect, Your Honor, as I'm joining Ms. Chun rather than replacing her, and given the minor nature of the charges, ethical rules permit my participation. Additionally, as I was present during the incident, my first-hand testimony is relevant to these proceedings." Sarah Chin quickly stood. "Your Honor, the defense has no objection to Ms. Johnson joining as co-counsel." The prosecutor shrugged. "The people have no objection either, Your Honor." Judge Harrington looked displeased but cornered. "Very well. Proceed, Ms. Johnson." Zoe placed her portfolio on the defense table, briefly squeezing her father's hand, a gesture not lost on those watching. She then turned to face the judge, her posture straight and confident. "Your Honor, I'd like to clarify the record regarding the events of April 15th. As my father stated, I was inside the gymnasium practicing my valedictorian speech. Principal Taylor had indeed given me permission to use the space and had arranged for access. However, there was a miscommunication regarding the key placement that evening." She opened her portfolio and produced a document. "I have here an affidavit from Principal Taylor confirming these facts, including her apology for the miscommunication and her decision not to press charges, which was overruled by the school district's legal department." As the bailiff took the document to the judge, Zoe continued, "Furthermore, I'd like to submit into evidence the text messages between Principal Taylor and myself regarding the arrangement, as well as the maintenance request form my father submitted the very next morning, offering to repair the damage at his own expense." Judge Harrington reviewed the documents, his expression gradually shifting from skepticism to uncertainty. "These text messages only show that you had permission to use the gym, not that your father had permission to break in." "Your Honor," Zoe replied calmly, "my father didn't break in for any nefarious purpose. He saw his teenage daughter alone in a dark building late at night and took the only action available to him when the promised access failed. The law recognizes necessity as a defense." "I'm quite familiar with the law, Ms. Johnson," the judge interrupted, his tone sharp. "Of course, Your Honor. Then you're also familiar with the precedent established in People v. Richards, where the court found that a parent acting to ensure the immediate safety of their child qualifies under the necessity defense, even when property damage occurs." Subtle tension music begins. Judge Harrington's face had grown increasingly flushed during Zoe's presentation. Something about the young attorney standing before him had begun to needle at his memory, something beyond her obvious intelligence and composure. "Ms. Johnson," he began, his voice carrying a new edge of uncertainty, "you mentioned you clerk for Justice Ramirez?" "Yes, Your Honor. I've had that privilege for the past 10 months. The judge tapped his pen against his legal pad. And before Northwestern, where did you complete your undergraduate studies? Zoe paused, clearly puzzled by this line of questioning, but maintaining her professional demeanor. Princeton University, Your Honor, political science with a minor in African American studies. Judge Harrington's pen stopped mid-tap. A strange expression crossed his face, a mixture of shock and something that looked almost like fear. Princeton, he repeated slowly. Class of 2021, Your Honor. The courtroom had grown silent, sensing the unusual tension building between the young attorney and the judge. Marcus looked at his daughter with a mixture of pride and confusion. Judge Harrington cleared his throat. And how did you finance your education at such prestigious institutions, Ms. Johnson? Scholarships, I presume? Saracen stood up. Objection, Your Honor. Relevance. I'm simply establishing Ms. Johnson's background, the judge replied, not taking his eyes off Zoe. I'm happy to answer, Zoe said confidently. Yes, I received several scholarships, including the Princeton Prize for Race Relations and the Harriet Tubman Fellowship. I also received the Marcus and Shanice Johnson Scholarship for Northwestern Law, named for my parents, funded through my mother's life insurance policy after her passing. Her voice caught slightly on these last words, but she quickly regained her composure. However, she continued, looking directly at the judge, my undergraduate education was primarily funded by the Harrington Education Foundation's Urban Achievement Scholarship. A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. Judge Harrington's face drained of color. You were a Harrington scholar? He asked, his voice uncharacteristically quiet. Yes, Your Honor. In fact, I believe we've met before. You presented the scholarship at the Foundation's annual gala in 2017. You told me then that my application essay was the finest you'd read in the program's history. The judge's eyes widened with recognition. Memory crashed over him like a wave, the bright-eyed teenager in a borrowed dress, the eloquent speech that had moved the donors to a standing ovation, the promise he had seen in her that reminded him of. Ms. Johnson, he said slowly, would you happen to know Elise Harrington? Now it was Zoe's turn to look surprised. Yes, Your Honor. Professor Elise Harrington was my faculty advisor at Princeton and later wrote my recommendation for law school. Judge Harrington sat back in his chair, the color continuing to drain from his face. Professor Harrington is my former wife. The courtroom erupted in whispers. The judge banged his gavel once, but with less force than usual. And, he continued, almost to himself, she often spoke of a brilliant student she mentored. He looked at Zoe with new eyes. She said the student reminded her of the daughter we never had. Zoe nodded slowly, processing this coincidence. Professor Harrington was instrumental in my education, Your Honor. She often spoke of her ex-husband, the judge, though she never mentioned you by name. She paused, then added carefully. She said he was once a man who believed deeply in justice and compassion before life's disappointments hardened him. The words hung in the air between them, loaded with meaning. Judge Harrington's usual mask of stern authority had slipped, revealing something vulnerable underneath shame, perhaps, or regret. Marcus watched this exchange with growing amazement, his earlier tears forgotten in the face of this extraordinary coincidence. Sarah Chun looked equally stunned, as did the prosecutor, who had remained silent throughout this unexpected turn of events. Your Honor, Zoe continued, her voice gentle but firm, my father has spent his entire life being the kind of man who puts others before himself. When my mother was diagnosed with cancer, he worked double shifts to pay for treatments not covered by insurance. When she passed, he somehow found the strength to be both parents to me while processing his own grief. She gestured toward Marcus. This is a man who volunteers at homeless shelters on Thanksgiving, who helps elderly neighbors with home repairs they can't afford, who has never missed a single one of my academic events despite working 60-hour weeks. Judge Harrington listened, really listened, perhaps for the first time that day, the night he broke that lock. Zoe continued, I was alone in that gym, my phone dead, wondering how I would get home. When I saw his face through that window, I didn't see a criminal. I saw my hero, doing exactly what he's always done, whatever it takes to keep his promise to my mother and to me. Emotional music swells softly. Judge Harrington sat in silence for a long moment, his usual commanding presence diminished by the weight of the moment. The courtroom remained hushed, as if collectively holding its breath. Finally, he spoke, his voice lacking its usual sharp edge. "Ms. Johnson, while your advocacy for your father is admirable, and these personal connections are certainly remarkable, the law remains the law. Your father did break into school property." Zoe nodded respectfully, but didn't back down. "Yes, Your Honor, and the law also provides for context and proportionality. My father has no criminal record. He attempted to remedy the situation immediately. The actual victim, Principal Taylor, has submitted an affidavit stating she doesn't wish to press charges." She paused, then added with measured emphasis, "And most importantly, the law recognizes that sometimes, in extraordinary circumstances, technical violations occur in service of greater moral imperatives, like a father ensuring his child's safety." The judge's jaw tightened. Despite the personal revelations, he wasn't prepared to simply dismiss the case. The school district, not Principal Taylor, is the complainant here, Ms. Johnson, and they have chosen to pursue these charges. "Then perhaps we should ask why," Zoe countered. "Why would the district pursue charges against a respected community member with no criminal history, against the wishes of the principal involved? For minimal damage that he offered to repair?" She reached into her portfolio again and produced another document. "I've taken the liberty of researching similar incidents in this district over the past 5 years. There have been 17 cases of after-hours access to school buildings resulting in minor property damage. Of those, only 3 resulted in criminal charges, all 3 involving black defendants." The prosecutor shifted uncomfortably. Judge Harrington's eyes narrowed, but he accepted the document when the bailiff brought it forward. "Your Honor," Zoe continued, "I'm not suggesting this case is solely about race, but I am suggesting that discretion has been exercised inconsistently, and that sometimes systems perpetuate injustice even without explicit intent." Judge Harrington studied the document, his expression unreadable. When he looked up, his eyes moved from Zoe to Marcus, who sat straight-backed and dignified despite the tears that had stained his cheeks earlier. The judge placed both hands flat on the bench and leaned forward. "Mr. Johnson," he said, addressing Marcus directly, "earlier in these proceedings, I reacted inappropriately to your emotional display. For that, I owe you an apology." A shocked murmur rippled through the courtroom. Judge the Hammer, Harrington never apologized for anything. Marcus nodded, surprise evident on his face. "Thank you, Your Honor." The judge continued, "I've sat on this bench for 30 years, Mr. Johnson. In that time, I've heard thousands of explanations, excuses, and sob stories. Perhaps I've grown cynical." He glanced briefly at Zoe. "Perhaps I've forgotten that behind every case number is a human being with their own struggles and their own story." He picked up the affidavit from Principal Taylor and studied it again. The law must be applied equally, but it must also be applied wisely. Justice without compassion becomes mere punishment, and a judge without humility becomes merely an obstacle to true justice. With that, he turned to the prosecutor. "Mr. Wilson, given the circumstances and new evidence presented, does the state wish to proceed with these charges?" The prosecutor stood, looking somewhat relieved. "Your Honor, in light of the affidavit from Principal Taylor and the defendant's clean record, the state is willing to consider diversion." "Diversion?" Zoe interjected. "With respect, diversion still implies wrongdoing requiring correction. My father acted out of necessity to protect his child, a defense recognized by law." Judge Harrington raised his hand. "One moment, Ms. Johnson." He turned back to the prosecutor. "Mr. Wilson, what would you say to a dismissal in the interest of justice?" The prosecutor hesitated only briefly. "The people would not object, Your Honor." "Then so ordered," Judge Harrington declared, bringing down his gavel with finality. "Case dismissed." Sound of gavel, then music swells. Marcus's shoulders sagged with relief as Zoe embraced him tightly. Sarah Chin shook both their hands, looking somewhat shell-shocked by the unexpected turn of events. Around them, the spectators in the courtroom buzzed with conversation. many smiling at the father-daughter duo who had just witnessed justice unfold in its truest form. As the courtroom began to clear, Judge Harrington spoke again. "Mr. Johnson, Ms. Johnson, would you join me in my chambers briefly?" Exchanging curious glances, father and daughter followed the judge through a side door into a spacious office lined with law books and the memorabilia of a long legal career. Once inside, with the door closed behind them, the judge's formal demeanor softened further. "Please sit," he offered, gesturing the chairs across from his desk. As they settled in, he remained standing, looking suddenly older and more human without the authority of the bench behind him. "Ms. Johnson, Zoe, I want you to know that Elise speaks of you often in the few communications we still share," he began. "She described you as the most promising student she'd encountered in 30 years of teaching. I see now that her assessment was accurate." Zoe smiled graciously. "Thank you, Your Honor. Professor Harrington changed my life with her mentorship." The judge nodded, then turned his attention to Marcus. "Mr. Johnson, I'm truly sorry for how I treated you in that courtroom today. There's no excuse for it." Marcus met his gaze steadily. "We all have bad days, Your Honor." "It was more than a bad day," the judge admitted, sitting down heavily in his chair. "It was the culmination of years of letting this job harden me, of seeing people at their worst day after day until I stopped seeing people at all, just cases, statistics, docket numbers." He glanced at a framed photo on his desk that both Marcus and Zoe could now see a younger version of the judge with a teenage boy. "My son hasn't spoken to me in 15 years. He said I became the very thing I once fought against, an instrument of a system that processes people rather than serving them." "It's never too late to change," Marcus said quietly. "I tell Zoe that all the time." The judge smiled sadly. "Your daughter is extraordinarily fortunate to have you as a father, Mr. Johnson. The dedication you've shown her, well, it's admirable." "It's not admirable," Marcus replied, his voice gentle but firm. "It's just being a parent. It's just love." Judge Harrington looked at him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Yes, I suppose I forgot that somewhere along the way." He cleared his throat. "Ms. Johnson, Justice Ramirez is a close colleague. Your work with her speaks volumes about your abilities. I hope today's unusual circumstances won't negatively impact your career." Zoe shook her head. "Justice Ramirez would be the first to say that standing up for what's right is never the wrong career move." "Indeed she would," the judge agreed with a small smile. He opened a drawer and removed a business card, sliding it across the desk to Marcus. "This is the contact information for the Harrington Foundation's Community Outreach Coordinator. We've been looking to expand our mentorship program for at-risk youth. Someone with your character and life experience would be an invaluable addition to our team-paid position, of course." Marcus looked surprised. "I appreciate that, Your Honor, but I'm not looking for charity." "It's not charity," the judge insisted. "It's recognition of value. Think about it." As Marcus and Zoe stood to leave, Judge Harrington extended his hand first to Zoe, then to Marcus. "Ms. Johnson, I look forward to watching your career with great interest. And Mr. Johnson, thank you for an important reminder today." "What's that?" Marcus asked. "That justice isn't just about applying the law. It's about seeing the humanity in each person who stands before it." Gentle, hopeful music. 3 months later, a community center gymnasium was filled to capacity. On a small stage, Judge Richard Harrington stood beside Marcus Johnson, both men in shirt sleeves, surrounded by a group of teenagers from the neighborhood. And so, the judge was saying to the assembled parents and community members, "Thanks to Mr. Johnson's leadership, our youth justice program has already enrolled 30 young people who are learning about the legal system, conflict resolution, and how to advocate for themselves and their communities." The audience applauded as Marcus stepped forward to the microphone. "When I stood in Judge Harrington's courtroom 3 months ago, I never imagined we'd end up as colleagues." A ripple of laughter moved through the crowd. But that's the thing about life. Sometimes our greatest challenges lead to our greatest opportunities. In the front row, Zoe Johnson watched proudly. Dressed in the conservative suit she now wore daily at the public defender's office, a career choice she had made after witnessing firsthand how a single advocate could change the course of justice. "We're not just teaching these kids about the law," Marcus continued. We're teaching them about second chances, about growth, about seeing beyond first impressions and past mistakes. He glanced at Judge Harrington, who nodded encouragingly. Judge Harrington and I came from different worlds, but we found common ground in wanting to make this community better. That's the message we want these young people to carry forward, that justice works best when we remember the humanity in each other. As the presentation concluded and refreshments were served, local news cameras captured the unlikely friendship that had blossomed between the judge and the maintenance worker, a living testament to the power of understanding and second chances. If this story touched something in you today, remember that in our own lives, we too face moments where we can choose judgment or understanding, rigidity or compassion. Every day, in ways big and small, we stand at crossroads where we can either reinforce the walls that divide us or build bridges that connect us. I hope this story inspires you to look beyond first impressions, to find the courage to stand up for what's right, and to remember that true justice is served not just through laws, but through love.